Hello everyone, I am Nizzahon here for the Aether Hub and back with another video on the history of Magic's banned and restricted lists. It took us 4 10-minute videos to get through the first year of the banned and restricted list. As we saw, it was a chaotic year in 1994 with cards being added and removed from it just about every month. 1995, luckily for Wizards, wasn't as chaotic with only 2 announcements occurring in the entire year, one in April and one in November. This means we can fit the whole year into only one video. 1995 was still a big year for Magic's history though. This is because it saw the creation of formats. Up until this point there was really only one format, just Magic, where all the sets were legal, but on January 10th of 1995 that all changed. Vintage and Standard were both created, both formats we still have around today. Like today, Vintage was a format where all of Magic's sets were legal. Standard was a little bit different at the time, only consisting of the most recent basic set, which we call a core set these days, and the 2 most recent expansions. At the beginning of 1995, this meant that only the Dark, Fallen Empires, and Revised Edition were in Standard. At the start, anything that was banned and restricted in Vintage had the same status on Standard when the format was born. But from now on, there isn't a single list to talk about, but 2 separate lists. Let's look at the first announcement of 1995, which occurred on April 19th. Even though there were now 2 formats, the first announcement in 1995 restricted the same 2 cards in both formats, Balance and Fork. 2 cards that had been around since Magic's beginning, but had so far managed to avoid getting restricted. Let's talk about Balance first. This is an inherently powerful card and one with some pretty sweet flavor. It forces each player to sacrifice lands and creatures equal to the fewest of each that were in play, and discard cards the same way, creating a state of balance on the board. 2 mana for that is pretty insane. And yes, this is a symmetrical effect, but decks that were running the full 4 copies of Balance found ways to abuse it, and honestly, it wasn't that hard. Some even consider Balance to be the most powerful white card ever printed, and I'm not sure that's wrong. The card basically just made players who cast it win the game. If things are going wrong for you in the game one way or another, say your opponent got a bunch of creatures out before you could, or your opponent had way more cards in hand than you, Balance could fix that. Control players could play very few creatures and use Balance to basically be a one-sided Wrath of God for 2 mana. This card was most abused in a deck that actually ran 0 creatures and was capable of dumping most of its hand onto the table on turn 1 and then casting Balance, putting both players in top deck mode, and plan on winning the game with the Rack. Balance got restricted, but so-called Rack control decks were still pretty good, and Balance was still one of the deck's best draws. More recently, Balance, which is still restricted in Vintage, saw play in Monastery Mentor control decks in the format, so it's still a relevant card today. It is banned in all other formats. In reality, not restricting Balance in 1994 was one of the biggest mistakes that Wizards made, and it was deserving of being restricted in 1995. The other card that had been around as long as Magic had, yet managed to avoid getting restricted in 94, was Fork. This spell let you copy an instant or sorcery for only 2 red mana, allowing you to choose new targets for the copy. While this effect is undoubtedly pretty good, we have actually seen an effect pretty similar to it more recently. Increasing Vengeance only lets you copy your own spells, but it also has Flashback, which enables it to not only be used again, but also to make 2 copies of the spell instead of just 1. There's even a spell doubling effect in Magic's most recent set, Ixalan, where Primal Amulet transforms into Primal Wellspring, a land that lets you cast double of instants and sorceries. Increasing Vengeance and other cards like it weren't cards that people were calling overpowered though, so why was Fork so good in 1995? Well, it has to do with the level of power of the spells that Fork was copying. Fork is yet another card that allowed people to undermine the restricted list, a theme we've seen before on these videos. Cards like Regrowth and Demonic Tutor that get restricted because they made it so you basically had more than 1 copy of restricted cards in your deck. Fork can allow you to do the same, allowing you to copy your Ancestral Recalls, Demonic Tutors, Berserks, Regrowths, and Falling Stars, among other things. Fork remained on the restricted list for almost 10 years, only coming off in 2004. After the restriction of these 2 cards, Wizards managed to go 7 full months before another announcement, which is an eternity when compared to the amount of time between the various announcements in 94, but in November of 95, Wizards did have to restrict and ban a few cards. Between the April and November announcements, a new set had been released, Ice Age. One card in particular in that set had been something of a problem, and it was restricted in both Standard and Vintage, and that is Zuran Orb. Channel was also newly banned in both formats. After having been on the restricted list, Wizards realized allowing the card to be played, even as a one-of, allowed too many games to be over before they even start because of things like the Channel Fireball combo, and they didn't want that to be part of the game anymore. Channel makes sense to us. It is a famously overpowered card now. It makes sense that they banned it. It's weird that they even tried restricting it. But why did they restrict a 0 mana artifact that allows you to sacrifice lands to gain 2 life? Let's talk some more about Zuran Orb. Today, Zuron Orb doesn't look like much to us, unless you play the Gitrog monster or Titania in EDH, in which case it's kind of nuts. But anyway, an effect like this isn't something we would think of as powerful today. Believe it or not, it had a good showing in 95, appearing in 4 of the top 8 decks at Worlds that year, and that is a big part of why it was restricted 3 months later. Zuron Orb was good in conjunction with one of the cards we already talked about in this video, Balance, where you could sacrifice your own lands to make sure your opponent ended up with 0, while you still gain a bunch of life. Similarly, it could be combined with Armageddon to lessen the impact of destroying your own lands. Your opponent won't get any value out of theirs all being destroyed, but you get to gain a bunch of life. And if you are the one casting Armageddon, you've probably got control of the board anyway. So Zuron Orb was the kind of card that could seal the deal for you at that point. Zuron Orb also happened to be good if you were playing against an opponent who was planning on blowing up all your lands too, so it managed to find its way into decks that didn't even run wide or have a plethora of way of destroying lands. It was a card that made some of Magic's already powerful cards even better, and that was viewed as a concern. Even after it got restricted, believe it or not, Zuron Orb continued to basically be a staple. All 8 decks that finished in the top 8 of Magic's very first Pro Tour New York in 1996, ran the one Zuron Orb they were allowed to run after it had been restricted. This was in part because of the rise of Necropotence, a card that let you pay life to draw cards, and a card that will show up again in this series. This is not the end of Zuron Orb's history of being banned or restricted either. Believe it or not, it will actually get banned in 1997, but we'll get into why that was in a later video. 2 other cards were banned in Vintage as well that were not banned in Standard, Falling Star and Chaos Orb. Cards we talked about in the last video that were sort of strange because they both asked the user to flip the card over the playing field, and the card affected different creatures or permanents depending on where it landed. In the last video, we talked about Wizards wanting to reduce the presence of these cards in the game because of how strange they were, and they let them stick around on the restricted list for almost a year, with Chaos Orb still being a staple really, until finally banning it and Falling Star in November of 1995. These 2 cards remain banned to this day in Vintage and aren't really legal anywhere, showing you how much of a mistake Wizards thought the design of these cards was. So Wizards actually had a pretty good year in 1995. In all, only 4 cards were added to the restricted list and 3 were banned, and only 1 card was actually printed that year, Zuron Orb. So they didn't design nearly as many overpowered cards as there had been in Magic's first 2 years. 1996 would also be a relatively low-key year, and I think I'll be able to fit all of that into one video as well. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to see more of my videos, you can head over to my channel, Nizzahon Magic, and subscribe here to the Aether Hub. Thanks for watching.